Hey you. Yes, you. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into tonight's true crime case. So, don't forget subscribe this channel and turn on notification. Story 1. I had flown to Australia that February to escape the relentless noise of my life. The idea was to rent a quiet place near the edge of the bushland, somewhere with weak reception, lots of space, and minimal distractions. The timing was perfect. The tail end of summer, when the heat mellowed just enough to make it bearable, and the evenings stretched long and golden. I found a secluded Airbnb just outside of Adelaide. It was a modest single-story cabin with rustic wooden finishes, floor-to-ceiling windows on the north side, and a wraparound veranda that overlooked a clearing lined with eucalyptus trees. The listing mentioned a few kilometers of walking trails nearby, kangaroos that sometimes came close to the yard, and no immediate neighbors. That last part sealed the deal. From the moment I arrived, the silence felt almost too complete. There were no cars passing, no buzzing city background, just cicadas humming in the heat and the occasional wind dragging itself through the dry trees. It should have been perfect, and it was. At first, I spent the first few days reading, journaling, and going on long walks. There was a strange sense of being completely alone, a kind of purity that bordered on surreal. Every creak of the cabin at night made me hyper-aware of my isolation, but I dismissed it as paranoia, urban nerves unused to such stillness. Then little things began to feel off. It started with my phone's battery. I kept it mostly off, relying on a paperback book and a manual map. But every time I turned it on, the battery was suspiciously low, draining faster than it should have, even in airplane mode. I chalked it up to the heat. A few days in, I noticed something on the corner shelf in the bedroom, a small object I hadn't paid attention to before. It looked like a decorative wooden carving, maybe a local trinket, but when I looked closer, it had a tiny, dark lens embedded in the middle. My stomach turned. It resembled a camera, but I wasn't sure. I unplugged it, just in case, and set it outside in the storage shed. The discovery nagged at me. I did a sweep of the cabin, trying to be logical, telling myself it was probably part of a dated alarm system or something harmless. But the more I looked, the more I found. Behind the bookshelf, tucked into the corner of the living room ceiling, behind a framed print, hidden lenses, all about the size of a coin. 1 or 2 I might have missed, but 5? Maybe more? I stopped counting when I reached 8. There was no brand name, no wires. Some were embedded in innocuous objects, others drilled subtly into walls. None of them blinked or made any sound. I felt the sickening weight of exposure settle over me. How long had they been on? Were they even active? And who was watching? The next morning, I packed my suitcase and prepared to leave early, but the car, a rental, refused to start. No signal on my phone, no visible neighbors, no sign of recent traffic on the dusty road. I had the option of walking to town, about 9 kilometers by trail, but something in me hesitated. That night, I hardly slept. Every creak of the wooden frame, every distant branch snapping outside made me freeze. I kept the lights off and sat in the kitchen with a knife I'd taken from the drawer, not because I intended to use it, but because I needed something tangible to cling to. I kept imagining I was being watched, not just from the cameras I'd found, but from outside, from the woods. The following day, I tried again to start the car. Nothing. Not even the dashboard lights came on. I popped the hood, expecting a dead battery, but found something else. Wires cleanly severed, deliberately cut. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't wear and tear. Someone had been near the vehicle. Recently, the panic that had been building quietly in the background now surged forward, full force. I returned inside, locked every door, and sat by the window with a notebook, trying to piece together what I knew. I marked the locations of the cameras I'd found, the dates I'd noticed odd things, the noise I heard outside at 3 a.m., the time I found the front gate open when I was sure I'd locked it, the odd smudge on the inside of the window that I didn't remember leaving. That night, something changed. I was jolted awake around 2 a.m. by a noise, like a footstep, but heavier. It came from the veranda, directly outside the bedroom. I held my breath, listening. Another step. Then silence. I crept out of bed and moved to the edge of the window, pulling the curtain aside ever so slightly. The darkness was almost total, but I could just make out a figure near the far edge of the yard, still and watching. They didn't move. Not for minutes. I stayed at the window until dawn. By morning, the figure was gone, but I found fresh boot prints in the dirt. I took photos of them using my phone before the battery died entirely. On the 6th day, I went out to the shed to look for tools, anything I could use to defend myself or get the car running. The inside of the shed was disturbed. The object I had removed, the first hidden camera, was missing. I never found it again. Later that afternoon, I spotted something hanging from a tree near the edge of the bush, a small cloth object. I walked carefully toward it, nerves stretched taut. It was a piece of my clothing, a t-shirt I thought was in my laundry bag, hung up like a flag. I stopped walking the trails after that. I never stepped beyond the cabin unless absolutely necessary. Each night brought the same fear, and I slept with all the lights on. The sun was my only safety. But even during the day, I caught glimpses, movements at the edge of the clearing, dark shapes that vanished when I looked directly at them. It was never close, never obvious. Just enough to make me question if I'd really seen anything. I didn't want to believe it was real. I told myself maybe someone had left the cameras there from years ago. Maybe the car trouble was coincidence. But I couldn't lie to myself anymore when I found the note. It was left on the veranda, placed exactly in the center of the welcome mat. A single line printed in bold black ink. I've always known when you're watching me too. I didn't touch the note. I took a photo of it from the doorway, then backed away. The air around the cabin felt different after that. Heavier, more alert, as if the place itself was waiting for something. I didn't know how long I had been watched. The knowledge made my skin feel like paper, too thin, too exposed. I wanted to scream or run, but both felt useless. My feet wouldn't carry me past the tree-line, and my voice would only echo into a void that wouldn't echo back. That night, I turned off all the lights for the first time. I thought maybe if I didn't give them a show, they'd get bored. Maybe I could disappear into the darkness too. I sat in the corner of the living room, behind the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the window. I didn't sleep. I just waited. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard the softest sound, like a whisper from wood. The front door handle turned slowly. It didn't creak or rattle. It turned gently, as if whoever stood outside knew the house intimately. It didn't open, but it tried. Then it stopped. I didn't move until morning. At first light, I checked the lock. Still bolted. The only sign of anything was a faint, greasy smudge on the handle, like a print, half wiped away. That day, I made the decision. I would leave on foot, walk the 9 kilometers into town, find help. But I waited until sunset. I don't know why. Maybe some irrational part of me still hoped that daylight made it safer. As the sun began to drop behind the trees, I packed what I needed: water, my ID, a flashlight, the map, and slipped out through the back, trying to avoid the more open parts of the yard. I followed the narrow walking trail that started behind the shed, moving quickly, but trying not to make noise. Every crack of twigs beneath my feet sounded deafening. The trail narrowed as I went deeper into the bush. I hadn't gone more than 2 kilometers before I started feeling it, being watched again. The silence behind me grew dense, as if something were pressing against it. Every so often, I turned back. Nothing, but the trees seemed closer than before, thicker. Half an hour in, I found something nailed to a tree, a strip of paper, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I didn't want to read it, but I did. You should have stayed inside. I tore it down and kept walking. I tried to follow the map, but it no longer matched what I was seeing. The path curved when it shouldn't have. Landmarks I had memorized were missing. It felt like the trail had shifted beneath me. At some point, I realized I had returned to the same part of the trail 3 times. The same bent eucalyptus tree, the same rust-colored rock formation. I was walking in circles. It was almost dark now, and I didn't want to be caught in the woods at night. I turned back, retracing my steps with growing dread. When I finally saw the outline of the cabin, I almost cried from relief. But then I stopped. Something was different. The front door was wide open. Inside, the lights were all on. I hadn't left it like that. I didn't go in. I backed away into the trees and circled around, trying to get a view inside through the windows. The kitchen light was flickering. A chair was overturned. My bag was on the floor, torn open. The feeling I'd had all week, the sense of being prey, now crystallized into certainty. Someone had been waiting for me to leave. They hadn't followed me. They'd gone inside. I hid in the bush for over an hour, watching the house, but no one came out. Finally, when the cold made it unbearable, I crept toward the shed and slipped inside. I locked the door from the inside with a rusty hook and lay down behind old crates, using an oily tarp as a blanket. That night, I dreamed I was underground, beneath the cabin, in a space I had never seen. It smelled like damp stone and electricity. In the dream, I could hear the whisper of a recording, my own voice, captured when I thought I was alone. The dream felt so real that I woke up gasping, convinced there was something below the house. I waited until morning again before entering the cabin. Inside, the place was ransacked. Cabinets open, drawers emptied. But it wasn't random, it was precise. Only my things were touched. Only my scent followed. I found a hidden hatch beneath the kitchen rug. I don't know why I checked there. Maybe some instinct. The boards were loose, the nails old. I pried it open and found a small crawl space below the cabin, dark, cramped, and lined with strange equipment. Cables, batteries, a makeshift monitor, all powered by a silent generator that ran underground. A nest. He had been beneath me the whole time. There were notebooks down there too. Pages and pages of writing. Not threats, not confessions, just observations. Timetables. Records of everything I had done since arriving. When I woke, when I slept, when I looked out the window, when I showered, what I wore, and photos. Hundreds of them. Most taken from the hidden cameras. Some taken from outside. I closed the hatch and left it open, hoping it would be discovered later. I didn't stay another night. That morning, I walked out with a heavy branch in hand, following the trail slowly, cautiously. This time, I kept my bearings and didn't stop. When I reached the edge of town, sunburned, dehydrated, and wild-eyed, I found a gas station and called the police. They took my statement. They searched the cabin. By the time they arrived, it had been cleared out. The crawl space was empty. No cameras, no notebooks, not even the generator. The owner of the Airbnb was untraceable. The listing was gone. The name he used was false. They offered me counseling, some vague apologies, and suggested I might be misremembering, that I'd been stressed imagining things. The police report was buried in bureaucracy, and I was sent home eventually, still shaken. Months later, back in my apartment on the other side of the world, I plugged in my phone to look at the old photos I'd taken. The footprints, the note, the camera in the shelf. But the gallery was empty, wiped clean. I don't remember deleting them. But sometimes when I use my laptop, the webcam light flickers for a split second, even when I'm not in a video call. Sometimes I wake up to find my bedroom door slightly open when I'm sure I closed it. And sometimes, only sometimes, I get emails with no subject, no content, from addresses that vanish when I try to reply. But they always have one thing in common. The subject line reads, "You still don't see all the cameras." Story 2. I arrived in Thessaloniki at the start of February 2025, chasing solitude in the off-season hush of the Aegean coast. The city still shimmered faintly with old-world charm, white stone facades, faded Byzantine remnants, and narrow alleys thick with stories. But the tourists had fled with the warmth of summer, and the streets, now quiet, offered me a kind of anonymous peace. I had rented a modest apartment on the third floor of an old building near Anopali, the upper town, where the wind wandered freely and church bells rang from unseen towers. The place had creaky floors, a crooked balcony, and a flickering hallway light that refused to stay fixed no matter how many times I tightened the bulb. I liked it that way. It felt real, unpolished and detached from time. The locals, though friendly enough, seemed guarded. On my second day, I walked into a small bakery and caught a glance. Something unreadable passed between the woman behind the counter and a man seated near the door. A flicker of concern. Or was it suspicion? I spent most mornings exploring ruins, taking photos, filling notebooks with stray thoughts. I avoided crowds, cafes, and the sea. The air near the water carried too many voices, even if the people weren't speaking. But there was something else I couldn't name, something brewing beneath the quiet. It was on my 4th day that the news broke. Not loudly, there were no sirens or screams, but in low murmurs, filtered through cafes and faded newspaper headlines. Unidentified explosion in city center. Casualties unconfirmed. The report was vague. Authorities cited a gas leak, maybe a power fault. But the phrasing was careful, not terror-related, it said, which was an odd thing to say when no one had claimed it was. That day, the city felt strange. The air was still, but alert, like something unseen had passed through and left everything humming. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I had come here to think, not to chase shadows. But by then, the dreams had already started. In them, I stood on an empty tram line, surrounded by tall buildings with black windows. The silence was so complete it rang in my ears. Then, far in the distance, a single figure walked toward me, featureless, slow, and utterly sure of itself. I always woke before it reached me. The next morning, I passed through the square where the explosion had supposedly occurred. There was no visible damage, just a cordoned-off area and an overabundance of uniformed presence. Soldiers stood with their backs to the ruins, eyes scanning everything but never settling. The silence there was louder than anywhere else in the city, like a pocket of frozen time. I noticed something strange, a cluster of pigeons circling above, never landing, as if even the birds avoided the ground. Back in my apartment that evening, I studied the photos I had taken earlier. One of them, taken from across the square, showed something odd in a third-story window. A silhouette, broad shoulders, head lowered, still, unmoving. When I returned the next day, the window was empty, but something about the building called to me. I walked along its side, hoping to find an address or placard, but found none. The entryway was sealed, the windows dusty, yet the lights inside glowed faintly, like distant lanterns behind fog glass. The city began to change in subtle ways. Announcements at bus stops grew distorted, as though re-recorded multiple times. Trash cans overflowed with unopened letters. Payphones, long and used, began ringing when I passed them, then fell silent before I could turn around. And then there was the figure. I began to see it everywhere. At first, I thought it was coincidence. A tall man in a gray coat, walking several paces behind me. But he never overtook me, never changed direction, always just far enough to question, never close enough to confront. Sometimes he was across the street, watching from under an archway. Other times, reflected in windows I walked past, though no one stood behind me when I turned. By the second week of February, the city felt less like a place and more like a performance, a loop. The same old man feeding the same birds, the same tram passing at exactly the same time, with exactly the same passengers. If I took a different route, I'd see the same newspaper from 3 days ago lying in the exact same gutter, barely faded by the weather. I asked someone at a kiosk about the bombing. The man frowned, paused, then said there had been no such event. He offered me a brochure for a historical walking tour instead. That night, I checked the local news archives. The incident had been erased. No mention of an explosion. No articles. No victims. But I remember the square, the tape, the uniforms. I remembered the headlines. I wasn't wrong. Something had happened. Something that had been made to disappear. It was then I noticed something else. My own photos, those I had taken a week before, had been partially corrupted. Not all. Just the ones near the square. Images that once showed street signs now showed blurred shapes. Faces were smeared, as if moving too fast. And always, in the corner of at least one frame, the gray figure. I started staying inside more. I pulled the curtains, unplugged my devices, and kept my journal hidden beneath the mattress. I couldn't explain it. but I felt I had stumbled into something I was never meant to see. And then the knock came. It wasn't loud, just 3 dull taps on the door around midnight. When I peered through the peephole, the hallway was empty, but I noticed a folded scrap of paper pushed onto the frame. It was blank on both sides. The next day, the hallway light was fixed. Bright. Steady. Too steady. I packed to leave, but my return flight had been canceled. When I called the airline, there was no record of my booking. My name no longer appeared on the guest list for the apartment, and the owner no longer responded to messages. I was no longer listed in the building's register. The reflection in the elevator mirror had a delay, just a moment, but enough to notice. I wasn't alone. I knew it was time to leave. My instincts screamed at me, and yet I couldn't bring myself to do it. The city had become too familiar, too suffocating. Every street I walked down, every turn I made, felt like it was leading me deeper into a place that was no longer mine to escape. My apartment was still empty, still unchanged, but now it was something else, an anchor, a tomb of sorts. And every time I left, I felt the walls watching me. In the following days, I spent my time in the quieter parts of the city. I moved through the corners I hadn't yet explored, unfamiliar alleyways, shadowed stairwells, and forgotten courtyards that felt outside of time. I tried to find some way to make sense of what had happened, but every place felt the same stale air, the same distorted light, the same sense of being watched. But it was the underground that I couldn't escape. The subterranean spaces of Thessaloniki were vast, forgotten, old tunnels beneath the streets, warehouses turned into shadowy catacombs, abandoned metro stations left untouched for decades. I had read about them in passing, little more than footnotes in travel guides, but now, with the city feeling so unfamiliar, they called to me. I wasn't sure how I ended up at the entrance of the old metro station. It had been sealed off for years, the entrance covered in layers of old brick and rusted gates. The name of the station was barely legible anymore, scratched off by time. But there was a flicker, a moment of clarity, when I realized this was no coincidence. The figure was with me again, always there in the corner of my vision, like a part of the landscape now. I could feel him, feel his gaze even when I couldn't see him. He was following me, always at the edges of my awareness, always just out of reach. I pushed through the barriers, ignoring the warning signs and barricades. I could hear the soft rumble of distant trains that hadn't run for years, and the muffled hum of electricity that still ran through the old cables. It felt as if I had entered another dimension, a place where the world I knew didn't exist, a place where things were just forgotten. At first, it was quiet. The only sound was my breathing, the occasional drop of water echoing through the empty tunnels. But as I ventured deeper, the stillness grew oppressive, thickening around me, filling every space. Then I saw them. Dozens of people, shadows more than figures, lined the walls of the tunnel. They didn't move, but their eyes were open, fixed on me. Their faces were blurred, indistinct, like reflections in broken glass. But I could feel their presence, all of them, watching in silence. My heartbeat raced. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Something held me there, pulling me toward them. I reached the end of the tunnel, where an old platform lay crumbling and abandoned. The dim lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And there, in the center of the platform, was a large screen, black and silent, yet somehow pulling me in. Without thinking, I stepped forward, drawn by some invisible force. The screen flickered to life. First, there was static, nothing more than a blur of white and black. Then, slowly, a figure began to emerge from the shadows. It was me, but it wasn't. The figure on the screen moved as I moved, mimicking my gestures, my actions, but distorted, out of sync. The figure raised its hand, and I felt my own hand lift involuntarily. Suddenly, the static returned, and the screen went dark. In the silence that followed, a single sentence flashed across the screen, written in bold letters. "You've seen too much." A sound, faint at first, but growing louder, began to pulse through the tunnel. A rhythmic thumping, like footsteps echoing from every direction. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, to move, their forms becoming clearer, more defined. They were not just shadows anymore. They were people, faces without names, figures who had once walked these streets but had been erased, forgotten by time. And now they were coming back. I turned to run, but the tunnel was no longer a path to escape. It had twisted, contorted, and I found myself back at the entrance of the metro station. The gate was no longer blocked. It was wide open. The city beyond looked the same, but the air had changed. It was heavy now, dense. It seemed to press against my skin, as if trying to squeeze me out of the world altogether. I stumbled through the city streets, not knowing where I was going, not sure what was real anymore. The shadows were still there, following me, never letting me escape. Faces of people I didn't recognize, appearing in windows, crossing the streets ahead of me, always just a few steps behind. It wasn't until I reached the square again, the one that had once been the site of the explosion, that I understood. The city wasn't the same. Not anymore. It had changed around me like the distortion on a screen, and I had become part of it, a part of something I couldn't understand. The square was still eerily quiet. No one was there, just me, alone, and yet not alone. I felt the eyes on me again. The figure was there, standing in the distance, watching from the shadows. The weight of it was unbearable. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard something familiar, a dull thump, a low rumble, a whisper of something that had been waiting to break free, a new explosion. But this time, there was no sound, no flashes of light, only the unmistakable feeling of everything shifting. Again, everything blurred, and I was gone. I woke up, lying in my bed, the morning light filtering through the blinds. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The room, the city, the sounds of everyday life beyond the walls. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw the figure standing behind me. Only this time, it wasn't a reflection. It was real. Story 3. I had never been a fan of the tourist trail. The idea of crowded museums, overcrowded markets, and bustling streets always felt more like a spectacle than an experience. That's why, when I decided to leave London in the dead of winter, I opted for the quiet solace of a small village in southern France, a place where I could lose myself in the peaceful rhythm of life. I found myself in a village called Saint Antoine, a charming little place tucked in the hills, far from the reach of the tourist masses. The village seemed to be stuck in time, narrow cobbled streets that twisted in every direction, ancient stone buildings with ivy crawling up their sides, and the unmistakable smell of freshly baked bread in the air every morning. The kind of place where the locals knew your name before you even spoke. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a few weeks of unwinding in a charming bed and breakfast with creaky wooden floors and a view of the surrounding vineyards. The kind of place where you could read, sip on wine, and forget the chaos of the world. But sometimes, even the most peaceful places carry the ghosts of things you'd rather not know. My first few days in the village were idyllic. I wandered through the fields, snapping photos of the rolling hills, the crumbling stone walls, and the occasional weathered farmhouse. I spent afternoons in the village square, drinking coffee and people watching, though there was something unsettling about how little the village seemed to change. The same faces, the same gestures, as if everyone here was living in an eternal moment. But as the days passed, something began to weigh on me. It wasn't obvious, not at first. It started with small things. The old woman at the bakery who gave me an odd look when I entered. The way the villagers would sometimes fall silent when I walked by. There was a distance between me and them, one I couldn't quite bridge. It felt like I was being observed, as if every step I took was being noted, analyzed. On the 7th day of my stay, I decided to take a long walk up the hill, behind the village, where a small chapel sat. I had been told by the innkeeper that the view from the chapel was breathtaking, an uninterrupted panorama of the valley below, with the river snaking through it like a silver ribbon. So I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and my camera and set off, eager to experience the landscape the village had boasted about. The walk wasn't difficult, but it was tiring. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the path as I made my way up. The village disappeared behind me, and soon I was alone in the quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. When I reached the chapel, I stood in awe. It was small, but the view was magnificent. The valley stretched out beneath me, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. For a moment, I could almost forget the unsettling feeling that had been creeping over me these past few days. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp air of the mountains. As I sat on the steps of the chapel, I noticed something odd, a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees. I didn't think much of it at first, probably a deer or some other animal. But then I saw it again, a figure slipping between the trunks of the trees, moving with deliberate intent. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was someone else from the village, out for a walk. But something about it felt off. The figure was too still, too controlled. And as I sat there, staring into the woods, the unease I had been feeling over the past few days seemed to grow stronger. It was like the air itself was thickening, pressing in around me. I stood up, ready to leave, when I felt a sudden sharp chill across my back. I turned instinctively, and for a brief moment I saw the figure again. Only this time it was closer. Too close. I grabbed my things and hurried down the hill, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. When I arrived at the bed and breakfast, I thought nothing of it. I chalked it up to my nerves and the exhaustion of the hike. But that night, when I went to bed, the feeling followed me, the sensation of being watched. The next morning, I decided to leave. The peace I had been seeking had turned into something else, something heavy, like an invisible weight pressing against my chest. I packed my bags and went down to the village square to settle my bill, hoping to leave with at least some semblance of normalcy. But when I reached the square, the village had a different atmosphere. The silence was heavier, more pronounced. The same faces I had seen for days now seemed unfamiliar, strange. Their eyes followed me as I walked, and though they smiled, there was something cold about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That afternoon, as I sat in a small cafe near the square, I saw him again, the man from the hill. He was standing in the doorway, his figure cloaked in shadows, watching me. The same stillness, the same coldness. And this time I knew. He wasn't just a stranger passing by. He was part of something I couldn't understand. I hurried back to the bed and breakfast, hoping to leave the village as quickly as possible. But the moment I reached the inn, I knew it was too late. I was already trapped. That evening, after dinner, I felt an uneasy shift in the air. The sun had set, and the village was bathed in an eerie twilight. I glanced out the window of my room and saw the figure again, standing in the street. This time, he was not alone. There were others. They stood in a loose circle around the inn, their faces hidden in the shadows. Their movements were strange, almost mechanical, as if they were following some unseen rhythm. And though they didn't speak, I could feel the weight of their presence. I felt as though the air itself was vibrating with tension. The door to my room creaked open, and I turned to see the innkeeper standing in the doorway. His face was expressionless, his eyes dark, but there was something different in his demeanor, something cold. I backed away, my heart racing in my chest. This was no longer just a feeling of being watched. It was something more. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The lock had somehow jammed. I was trapped, and I wasn't alone. The stillness in the room grew more oppressive by the second. I could hear the faint hum of the village outside, somewhere distant but real. The muffled sound of footsteps, of people moving in the streets. But in my room, everything was too quiet, too still. The innkeeper didn't move. He stood in the doorway like a shadow. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to look right through me, and yet I couldn't pull away from his gaze. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. Something held me there, frozen in place. Then, behind him I saw them. The figures from the street had gathered at the edge of the inn's courtyard, standing motionless in the dark. Their faces remained hidden, but there was no mistaking the intent in the way they stood, too perfectly aligned, too still. A part of me wanted to call out to the innkeeper, to demand what was going on, but I knew better. I knew that whatever this was, it had already started. Without a word, the innkeeper stepped aside, and I saw him more clearly now. His movements were deliberate, but there was no warmth, no hospitality left in him. His eyes didn't blink. I didn't even know if he was breathing. As I backed up against the wall, I thought about bolting from the room, but the door was still jammed. I turned to the window, desperate. The village below seemed unchanged, the streets bathed in soft lamplight, but I knew it was a facade. The distance between me and the rest of the world was growing, the ground beneath me shaking in subtle waves. Then I felt it, a cold presence in the room. I spun around and saw the shadow move, too fast, too fluid. The figure from the hill, the one I had seen before, was now standing just inside the doorway. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel the malice in his presence. He stepped forward, and I instinctively backed up further, my heart thudding in my chest. The shadows seemed to stretch around him as though they were alive, crawling along the walls, reaching for me. I was trapped in the corner of the room, no way out. His presence felt like a vice closing around me, and as he drew closer, I could hear a faint whisper, something unintelligible but unmistakably sinister. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was dry, tight. He reached out a hand, and I recoiled, my back pressed against the window frame. The door suddenly flung open, and in the blink of an eye, the innkeeper was gone. The figure at the door didn't hesitate. He moved toward me with a predatory calm, and before I could react, I felt the sharp sting, a quick, cold pressure in my side. It was like a sudden, electric shock. I gasped, staggering back. The room seemed to spin around me as I clutched at my side, feeling the warmth of blood seeping through my fingers. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, the world fading into a blur of shapes and shadows. The figure didn't speak. He just stood there, motionless, watching me. But that was when the village shifted. The figures in the street, the ones that had been standing still outside the inn, began to move. They converged on the building, slowly, methodically. Their steps were in perfect synchrony, moving as one, as though controlled by some unseen force. I could hear the sound of their feet on the cobblestones, each step growing louder, closer. I struggled to my feet, trying to move, but the pain in my side was overwhelming. I stumbled, clutching the wall for support. The room seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with its stillness. The figure in front of me remained as cold and impassive as ever, watching me fall apart. The door to the inn swung open once again, and the first of the figures from outside entered. He was tall, thin, his face obscured by a dark hood. He walked toward me with purpose, his eyes hidden beneath the folds of the cloak. As he neared, I could feel the temperature drop in the room, the cold creeping up my spine, filling my lungs with a suffocating chill. I tried to move again, but my legs refused to cooperate. The room spun wildly around me as my vision blurred. I could feel the weight of the air pressing against me, pushing me down. The last thing I remember was the cold, biting pain in my side, the world spinning faster, and the growing sound of footsteps approaching, as though the entire village was closing in on me. Underscore 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 underscore. I woke up in a dimly lit room, disoriented and confused. My side throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and I was lying in an unfamiliar bed. The walls were bare, the room cold, and the only light came from a faint, flickering bulb above. It took me a moment to realize that I wasn't in the inn anymore. This place felt different. The air was heavy, dense, and the silence was almost unbearable. I tried to move, but my body was weak. I could barely sit up, my head spinning as I tried to push away the fog in my mind. Then, I heard the soft creak of a door opening. A figure stepped into the room. A man, but not the one from before. This man was older, his face weathered and tired, his eyes full of sadness. He moved toward me slowly, as if unsure whether to approach. His gaze was filled with an odd mixture of pity and resignation. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and calm. I stared at him, unable to speak. My throat was raw, and my mind was struggling to process what was happening. "You've been marked," he continued, looking away as if he couldn't bear to look at me any longer. "There are things you can't understand, things that should have stayed buried." He took a step back, as if realizing he'd said too much. I tried to sit up further, but the pain in my side flared, and I winced, clutching the bed. He didn't wait for me to speak. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me with the weight of his words and the growing realization that whatever had happened in the village, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. Story 4. I had been in the village of Montbrun for just a few days when I first noticed the eerie undercurrent that seemed to lurk beneath its charming exterior. Situated in the foothills of the French Alps, Montbrun was the kind of place where life moved slowly, where the cobblestone streets seemed untouched by time. The residents spoke in soft, lilting accents, and the small cafes along the square served coffee so strong it could wake the dead. I had come for the quiet, for the isolation, away from the bustling noise of Paris, hoping to find solace and perhaps inspiration for my writing. The village seemed peaceful enough. I walked its winding streets, wandered through the vineyards that spread like green blankets over the valley, and spent hours by the river, where the water ran clear and fast, almost as if it had somewhere important to be. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the mountain peaks towered over the village like ancient sentinels, watching over a land that had long since forgotten the wars and struggles of the world below. Yet, beneath this serene beauty, there was a darkness, a feeling that I could never quite shake. It wasn't something I could describe outright, but it was there, hiding in the corners of my vision, like an unseen shadow. The people of Montbrun were kind, if a little distant. It wasn't unusual for small villages to be reserved with strangers, and I didn't mind the space. But as the days passed, I began to sense an unease in the way people looked at me, an air of unspoken tension. The local shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a soft smile, would greet me warmly, but there was something hollow in her eyes. The innkeeper, a man in his late 40s, would give me knowing glances when our paths crossed, but he never lingered long enough to say anything of substance. It was on the 6th day of my stay that I first heard of the tragedy that would come to haunt me for the rest of my time in Montbrun. I had been strolling through the village square when I saw a group of people gathered near the church. It was an unusual sight. Nothing ever happened in Montbrun, so when the people gathered, it was a rare occurrence. As I approached, I overheard snippets of conversation, whispers, hushed voices. They spoke in French, of course, but even with my limited understanding, I caught the words: disappearance, police, a child. It didn't take long for me to learn the truth. An 11-year-old girl had gone missing. Her name was Isabel, the daughter of one of the more well-known families in Montbrun. Her parents owned a small vineyard on the outskirts of the village, and though I had never spoken to them, I had seen Isabel from a distance, her bright eyes and unsteady steps as she played near the river, her laughter echoing in the crisp air. She was a lively, energetic child, always full of life. To hear that she was missing, that she had simply vanished, felt impossible. The villagers seemed to take it in stride, as if this was something that happened every so often. There were murmurs of concern, of course, but no one seemed to be truly alarmed. They went about their business, as though it was just another day. The police were involved, and search parties were formed, but they seemed strangely ineffective. The mountain paths, the forests, the river, everything was searched thoroughly. But no trace of Isabel was ever found. The disappearance lingered in the air, like a stain on the village's peaceful facade. It gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the web of suspicion that was slowly unfolding before me. A few days after Isabel's disappearance, I decided to take a walk along the river to clear my mind. It had been a while since I had been out in the open air, and the weight of the mystery pressing on the village was starting to make me feel claustrophobic. I wandered through the trees, following the path that led to the old stone bridge, the one Isabel often played near. It wasn't far from the village, and I hoped the quiet of nature would ease my nerves. As I walked, I couldn't help but think of Isabel, the way she had played by the river, the way her laughter had echoed off the mountainside. as though she were the only person in the world who mattered. I tried to imagine what it would be like to lose someone like that, someone so full of life, so full of promise. And I realized I couldn't. I didn't want to. I reached the bridge, a place that had always seemed so peaceful, so untouched by the world. The water below flowed fast, swirling around the rocks, and for a moment I stood there, letting the sound of the river drown out my thoughts. But when I turned to leave, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There, lying at the foot of the bridge, half hidden by the overgrown weeds, was a small object. It was a doll, the kind that children played with. Its features were faded, its dress torn, as though it had been lying there for some time. I didn't know why, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. It was Isabel's doll, I realized. I had seen her playing with it many times before. A sense of dread settled over me as I picked it up, holding it in my hands. It was cold to the touch, like it had been left out in the snow. The threadbare fabric of its dress felt rough against my skin. I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't just leave it there, but I didn't want to take it back to the village either. I had no explanation for why it was here, or why it was so far from Isabel's home. I stood there for a long time, staring at the doll, and then the thought crossed my mind. What if Isabel hadn't just disappeared? What if something else had happened? Something darker? The realization hit me like a sudden blow, and I nearly dropped the doll in shock. The village had been hiding something. I could feel it in my bones. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like Isabel's disappearance wasn't just a random event. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated, deliberate act, something that had been planned. I made my way back to the village, but as I approached the square, I noticed a change. The atmosphere had shifted. People were whispering more than usual, casting furtive glances toward the church, the inn, the square. It was as though a veil of fear had descended upon Montbrun. The air had grown thick, and the smiles I had once received now seemed strained, forced. It wasn't until the following evening that I understood what had happened. I had been sitting in the inn, nursing a glass of wine, and staring at the flickering candlelight, when the innkeeper came to my table. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Isabel," he said, his voice low. "She was found. In the woods." I nodded, not sure what to say. "Was she?" The innkeeper didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The silence between us stretched long. I could see it in his eyes. He knew the truth, or at least part of it. Isabel had been found, but not in the way one would hope. The search parties had found her body, abandoned near the woods. There were no obvious signs of violence, but the way she was found, the way she had been left in the snow, made it clear that whatever had happened to her, it had been done with cold calculation. I didn't know how to react, how to process the news. I had come to Montbrun for peace, for inspiration, but instead, I had uncovered something much darker. The village's secret had been exposed, and I had become a part of it, whether I liked it or not. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the mystery pressed down on me. I couldn't escape it. The questions, the uncertainty, the lingering sense that the village wasn't what it appeared to be. It was all too much. And somewhere in the dark, in the shadow of Montbrun's quiet streets, Isabel's spirit lingered, trapped in a village that would never be the same again. The following days after Isabel's body was found were filled with an unsettling quiet. The villagers seemed to retreat even further into themselves, their once familiar faces now closed off, their expressions distant. It was as if Montbrun had become a place suspended between light and shadow, caught in the grip of something too horrible to acknowledge. I spent my days wandering aimlessly, unable to shake the weight of the discovery. I couldn't stop thinking about Isabel, the way she had laughed and played, her innocence, so alive and vibrant, and now nothing. The body had been found near the woods, but no one seemed to know the full story. They didn't speak of it openly. Whispers filled the air, but the truth remained buried in the silence. The innkeeper became more withdrawn, and the few remaining villagers I spoke with seemed unable or unwilling to answer any of my questions. Even the police were tight-lipped, their presence more of an ominous reminder than a comfort. I couldn't let go of the feeling that there was something else, something they weren't telling me. the strange way people reacted, their quick glances when they thought no one was looking. It felt like the whole village was in on something dark and secret. It was on the fourth day after Isabel's death when I met someone who would finally offer a fragment of truth. I was walking through the village square near the church when I saw an elderly man sitting on a bench, looking out at the mountains. He was thin, with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to have seen far too much in his lifetime. He didn't look up when I sat down next to him, but something about his presence was different from the rest of the villagers. There was a heaviness about him, as though he had once been part of the world, and now he was disconnected from it all. I wasn't sure why I decided to speak to him, but the silence between us grew too oppressive, and I finally asked, "Do you know what happened to Isabel?" His gaze flickered to me for a brief moment, and then he looked back toward the mountains. "The mountains have many secrets," he said, his voice rough and raspy, like a man who hadn't spoken in years. "Not all of them are meant to be known." I stared at him, trying to make sense of his cryptic words. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew the answer would only deepen the mystery. He didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, but I could feel his mind racing, as if he was debating whether or not to reveal whatever it was he knew. After a long pause, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Isabel wasn't the first." His words struck me like a blow, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. "What do you mean?" I repeated, this time more urgently. He turned his head toward me, and his eyes bore into mine, dark and knowing. "The mountains," he said softly. "They take what's offered to them. Isabel wasn't the first, and she won't be the last." I couldn't make sense of what he meant by that. What does that have to do with the village? The man's expression softened, but there was still a trace of fear behind his eyes. The village, the people, they know. They know things they don't want outsiders to understand. The mountains demand something, and the village has been offering it for years. Every generation has been a part of the ritual. I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ritual." The man nodded slowly. "It's an old tradition, passed down through the generations. Something the villagers have always done to keep their land, their lives safe. But not everyone is meant to understand it. Not everyone is supposed to know." I didn't know what to think. The man had said enough to send a chill down my spine, but nothing he said made sense. How could a village, a whole community, be involved in something like this? And what did it have to do with Isabel? Before I could ask any more questions, the man stood up abruptly, his movements stiff and quick. "You should leave," he said, looking around nervously. "Go back to where you came from. This place, it's not for you." I wanted to protest, to demand more answers, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was afraid, and in that moment I realized that whatever he knew, it wasn't something he could share. He turned and walked away, leaving me on the bench, more confused than ever. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, my thoughts racing. The man's words repeated in my mind. The mountains demand something. What did that mean? And why had he said Isabel wasn't the first? How many children had been lost to this unknown ritual? The fear in his eyes was enough to make my skin crawl. I couldn't just let it go. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make a coherent picture. I needed to know more. I had to understand what had happened in Montbrun, what had been happening for years, and what the mountains had to do with any of it. The next morning, I set out to find answers. I walked toward the outskirts of the village, following the path that led up into the mountains. The air was thin and cold, the ground beneath my boots stiff with frost. As I walked, the silence of the mountains pressed in on me, a heavy, oppressive feeling that grew with every step. Eventually, I found myself standing at the edge of a small clearing. The trees here were dense, their branches heavy with snow. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find something. I had to uncover the truth. And then I saw it, a small, weathered stone marker, half hidden beneath a blanket of snow. It was old, far older than anything else in the village. And as I knelt to examine it, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The carving on the stone was faint, almost worn away by time, but I could make out the shape of a figure, a symbol that was unfamiliar but somehow chilling. Suddenly, the air grew colder, the wind picking up as though it were alive, swirling around me. I stood up quickly, heart racing, and turned back toward the village. But before I could take a step, I heard something, a soft, distant sound, like a child's laughter, carried on the wind. My blood ran cold. It was Isabel's laugh. I turned around, but the clearing was empty. The stone marker loomed behind me, its eerie presence all that remained. And then, in that instant, I understood. Isabel wasn't the first child to be taken. She wouldn't be the last. Montbrun, with its quiet streets and peaceful facades, was built on a secret too dark to confront. And the mountains, ancient and relentless, would always demand their price. I left Montbrun that day, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what I had discovered. The village would continue, its people bound to the past, to the ritual they couldn't escape. And as for me, I would carry the weight of their secret for the rest of my life. Story 5. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful month in Brussels. I had arrived in the city at the beginning of February, eager to explore its hidden corners and take in the architecture and culture that had so long been on my list. Brussels, with its cobblestone streets and grand squares, seemed like the perfect place to escape the mundane, to lose myself in the flow of daily life. But in the weeks leading up to my arrival, I had heard disturbing whispers. People in cafes and bookstores spoke in hushed tones about a spike in gun violence that had been sweeping through the city, an unsettling trend that no one could explain. I had brushed it off at first, assuming it was just media exaggeration or the usual fear-mongering that comes with news of crime. But as I walked through the city each day, I began to notice the subtle signs. The nervous glances exchanged between strangers, the way people would check over their shoulders more often than seemed necessary, the quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air like an unseen storm cloud. It was on my second week in the city that the unease I had been sensing began to crystallize into something more real. I had been walking down Rue de la Loi, heading toward Parc Leopold, when I noticed a small group of people gathered outside a cafe. They were standing a little too close to the windows, and their voices were lower than usual, as though they were trying to keep their conversation private. As I passed by, I overheard fragments of their words, gunshots, escalating, too many. At first, I thought it was just another rumor, another bit of gossip that would fade as quickly as it had started. But later that afternoon, as I sat in a quiet park near the Atomium, the news on my phone confirmed the rumors. There had been an increase in shootings across Brussels in recent weeks. The city was facing a sudden and unexplained rise in violence, with several neighborhoods experiencing escalating tensions. The police were stretched thin, and the city's authorities seemed unsure of how to contain the situation. The reports didn't provide many details, just numbers, brief descriptions, and vague assurances that everything was under control. But something in the tone of the articles struck me as odd. There was a sense of urgency beneath the surface, a growing realization that something more was at play. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a crime wave. As the days went on, I found myself paying closer attention to the subtle changes in the city. More police officers on the streets, more barricades, and an ever-growing presence of security. At night, the usual hum of Brussels seemed muted, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something they couldn't quite name. I would walk through the quiet streets, my steps echoing louder than usual in the absence of bustling crowds, and every now and then I would hear the faintest sound, distant, like a soft rumble, as if the city itself were trembling in anticipation. One evening, I found myself near the Cinquantenaire Park, a large green space that I had visited a few times since arriving. The park was eerily empty, the usual joggers and families replaced by an unnatural stillness. I walked along the gravel paths, my footsteps muffled by the soft dirt, when I saw a group of people standing off to the side, gathered near the entrance to a building. They were whispering among themselves, their faces tense, as though they were afraid of being overheard. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached, trying not to draw attention to myself. As I neared the group, I could hear them talking more clearly. They were speaking in hurried, frantic tones, talking about the latest shooting in the city. The name of the victim wasn't mentioned, but the details were chilling. It had happened during rush hour, in a crowded square, in broad daylight. Someone had opened fire in the middle of a busy crowd, causing chaos and panic. The police had arrived too late, and by the time they had secured the area, the shooter was gone. I couldn't help but wonder, what was happening in Brussels? Why was this violence escalating so rapidly? And more importantly, who was behind it? That night, I couldn't sleep. The words of the group in the park echoed in my mind. The city felt like it was teetering on the edge of something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing in the middle of it all, waiting for the inevitable. The next morning, I decided to venture out early, hoping to get a better sense of what was going on in the city. I walked through the streets, paying attention to the subtle changes in the atmosphere. The usual rhythm of the city had shifted. People no longer smiled as they passed each other. There were fewer tourists, fewer people out enjoying the cafes and shops. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next incident, the next outbreak of violence. I passed by a local newsstand and noticed that the headlines on the papers were dominated by stories of gun violence. It seemed to be all anyone was talking about. The articles didn't offer much in the way of explanation, only that the violence was spreading, that the police were struggling to keep up with the number of incidents. No one seemed to know why this was happening or who was behind it, but it was clear that the city was on edge. It wasn't long before I started noticing the signs of something deeper, something sinister. There was a pattern to the attacks, a rhythm that seemed to repeat itself. The violence wasn't random, it was targeted. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the attacks were not simply about crime. They were a message. The first major incident had been in a popular shopping district, where a lone gunman had opened fire in the middle of a busy afternoon. Several more followed, each one more brazen, more calculated. And then there were the anonymous flyers that began appearing on street corners and in cafes, printed with bold letters that read, "The time for silence is over. The people demand justice." I wasn't the only one who had begun to notice the pattern. The people in Brussels were talking more openly about what was happening, exchanging theories and suspicions. Some believed it was the work of a radical group. Others thought it might be a series of isolated incidents with no connection to each other. But as the days passed, it became clearer that something was building in the city, a wave of fear, a growing distrust, and a feeling that the violence wasn't just happening in isolated pockets anymore. It was everywhere. One afternoon, as I walked down the street near the Grand Place, I saw a police car speeding past, lights flashing. The sound of sirens became a constant backdrop to my days, a reminder that something was always happening just out of sight. People walked faster now, their eyes darting nervously as they passed each other. There was a sense of urgency in the air, an undercurrent of panic that seemed to grow with every passing day. I began to feel like I was being watched. It was a subtle feeling, but it was there. The streets, once so familiar, now felt foreign, as though I was a stranger in my own skin. Every corner I turned, I felt eyes on me. The city had become a maze of suspicion and fear, and I didn't know where to go or who to trust. One evening, as I sat in a dimly lit cafe near the Sablon, trying to make sense of everything that was happening, I overheard a conversation that made my heart race. A man dressed in a dark coat was talking to the barista, speaking in hushed tones. From what I could hear, he was mentioning a list of targets, people who had been singled out for the violence. His voice was low, but his words were clear. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. The violence wasn't random. It wasn't just about chaos. It was planned. The city was being used as a chessboard, and the pieces were being moved according to some unseen hand. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The spike in gun violence wasn't just a crime wave. It was something more organized, more deliberate. And I had become a witness to it all. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me, like a fog I couldn't escape. Every day, the weight of the city's tension seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on everyone I passed. The quiet conversations on the streets, the hushed voices in cafes, all hinted at something I couldn't quite place. Something dark that was tightening its grip on Brussels. The more I learned, the less I understood. The police were overwhelmed, but their response seemed almost mechanical, as if they were following an invisible script. News outlets reported the numbers, the names of the victims, the locations of the incidents, but the pattern remained elusive. It wasn't just random violence. There was something orchestrated behind it, something more deliberate. A force working in the shadows, pulling strings, and pushing the city toward chaos. By the third week of February, the violence had escalated. The shootings were no longer limited to certain areas. They were happening everywhere. The city felt like a pressure cooker, with tensions building to a breaking point. I had started to avoid crowded areas, taking the quieter, less frequented streets when I went out. But even there, I couldn't escape the ever-present fear. The sound of distant sirens had become a permanent soundtrack to my life, and every time I saw a group of people gathered, I instinctively held my breath, waiting for something to break. One evening, as I walked near the Brussels Central Station, the streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows on the pavement. I noticed a group of people gathered outside a small bookshop. They weren't talking, just standing in silence, staring at something in the distance. I stopped, my curiosity pulling me closer. As I neared, I realized they were all looking at a large poster on the wall. It was a simple design, black and white, with bold letters that read, "The time for change is now." I stood there for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was something about the message that felt off, almost like a warning. The crowd was unnervingly quiet, and I couldn't help but feel that they weren't just reading the poster. They were waiting for something. A few minutes passed before I turned to leave, my mind racing. Who had put up that poster? Was it part of the larger movement I had started hearing whispers about? A new radical group, perhaps? The thought that this was all somehow connected to a single, larger force gnawed at my mind. I walked briskly back to my apartment, eager to put some distance between myself and the unsettling scene at the bookshop. But the feeling of being watched, of being caught in something far larger than I could understand, followed me like a shadow. That night, the news reports became even more chilling. The shootings weren't just increasing in number. They were becoming more brazen, more coordinated. The latest incident had occurred just hours before, in the middle of a crowded metro station. The gunman had fired indiscriminately into the crowd, leaving dozens wounded. But unlike previous incidents, this time, the attacker had been caught on camera, his face visible for all to see. The footage was grainy, but the man's expression was clear. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cold, unsettling calm. He didn't seem to be acting out of anger or desperation. He seemed almost detached, as though he were carrying out an assignment. As the days passed, I couldn't ignore the growing fear in the city. The police were increasing their presence, but it felt like they were always one step behind. The gunmen were always moving faster, always staying one step ahead. It was as if they knew exactly how to make their attacks, how to disappear into the crowd without leaving a trace. The message behind the violence was becoming clearer by the day. These weren't random acts of crime. They were targeted attacks, part of a larger movement. A movement that seemed to be calling for change. But what kind of change? And what was the purpose behind all of this violence? I couldn't help but think about the poster I had seen outside the bookshop. The phrase, "the time for change is now," echoed in my mind, its meaning growing more ominous with each passing hour. And then, one evening, as I sat in my apartment, my phone buzzed with a breaking news notification. My heart skipped a beat as I read the headline, "Brussels in Chaos. Group claims responsibility for recent attacks." I clicked on the article, my hands trembling. The group had finally revealed themselves. They were calling themselves Les Revolts, the Rebels, and their manifesto had been posted online just hours earlier. The group was claiming that the violence was a response to the oppressive systems in place, a call to tear down the institutions that had allowed the city and the world to spiral into inequality and division. The group promised more attacks, each one bigger and more impactful than the last, until their message was heard and change was achieved. I couldn't believe it. The violence wasn't random. It was part of a plan, and I was witnessing it unfold in real time, caught in the middle of a city on the brink of something that could change everything. The attacks didn't stop. They grew more intense, more widespread. Every corner of Brussels was affected. I had to leave the city, but something inside me urged me to stay, to witness the collapse of a system I had once thought stable. The final attack came a week later. It was planned for the heart of the city, in the very square I had stood in on my first day here. It was during the evening rush hour, when the square was filled with commuters heading home. I had been near the square earlier in the day, but something told me to leave before sunset, to take a different route. As the hours passed, the news began to pour in. It was the largest attack yet. Explosions rang out across the square, followed by gunfire. People scattered in every direction, fleeing the chaos. It was a massacre in the middle of the city, the final act in a plan to topple everything. The attacks didn't stop. They grew more intense, more widespread. Every corner of Brussels was affected. I had to leave the city, but something inside me urged me to stay, to witness the collapse of a system I had once thought stable. The final attack came a week later. It was planned for the heart of the city, in the very square I had stood in on my first day here. It was during the evening rush hour, when the square was filled with commuters heading home. I had been near the square earlier in the day, but something told me to leave before sunset, to take a different route. As the hours passed, the news began to pour in. It was the largest attack yet. Explosions rang out across the square, followed by gunfire. People scattered in every direction, fleeing the chaos. It was a massacre in the middle of the city, the final act in a plan to topple everything. I watched the news from my small apartment, the images on the screen flashing like a nightmare. The square, once full of life, was now a scene of devastation. The camera zoomed in on the empty, silent spaces where people had once gathered, and for the first time, I realized that I had witnessed something that could never be undone. Brussels, as I had known it, was no longer the same. The violence had claimed more lives, but it had also left an indelible mark on the city. The group Les Revolts had succeeded in their mission, in ways they may never have intended. The city had been changed forever, its heart broken, and its spirit fractured. As for me, I stayed in Brussels for a few more days, walking through the empty streets, now eerily quiet in the aftermath. There was no longer any sense of community, just fear and uncertainty. It was a city suspended in time, caught between its past and its uncertain future. And as I left Brussels in early March, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. The city might have changed, but the violence, the fear, it wasn't over. The world had shifted, and I had been there to see it happen. Story 6. I had been to many events before, press conferences, award shows, political rallies, but nothing quite like the Super Bowl. The energy of the crowd, the flashing lights, the frenzy of activity that surrounded the event. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. As a journalist, covering the Super Bowl was both a privilege and a responsibility. Everyone expected the best coverage, the most insightful analysis, and the ability to capture the true essence of such a monumental occasion. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, excitement, and sport. But for me, it turned into something far darker. The day had started like any other major event I had covered. Busy, overwhelming, and filled with a never-ending stream of people demanding attention. Reporters, cameramen, security personnel, VIPs. It felt like a whirlwind of activity, each person vying for a moment in the spotlight. As I made my way through the stadium to set up for the evening's coverage, the energy was palpable. Fans in jerseys, the smell of popcorn, the overwhelming buzz of anticipation. It was all so surreal. For most of the people in the stadium, it was the pinnacle of the year, a culmination of their passion for football. For me, it was another assignment. I had been assigned to cover the event for my network, focusing on the broader atmosphere. Interviews with fans, reactions to halftime shows, and behind-the-scenes glimpses. The regular games and interviews were always fascinating, but I had been tasked with capturing the emotions, the experiences of those who had traveled from across the country to witness this sporting spectacle. But something was different that day. There was an odd tension hanging in the air, something I couldn't place at first. It wasn't the usual excitement or the expected chaos of a large-scale event. No, this was different. As I moved through the crowd, I began to notice the way people were acting. Some of them were too still, too quiet for a setting like this. There was a low murmur among them, whispers that faded whenever anyone came too close. My instincts told me that something wasn't right, but I pushed those feelings aside, thinking it was just my nerves. When the Super Bowl finally began, I positioned myself with the other reporters in the press section, my camera ready, my notebook in hand. The sound of the crowd roaring was deafening as the game kicked off, and I could feel the electricity in the air. But amidst it all, I couldn't shake the sense that something was brewing beneath the surface. There were more security checks than usual, more officers stationed in the stands, and the heavy presence of surveillance cameras following every move. It wasn't just the standard security for a major event. It was as if the whole stadium was under siege, though no one seemed to acknowledge it. The game progressed, the excitement swelling as the teams played with incredible intensity. Fans cheered, clapped, and shouted as the minutes ticked away, but I found myself distracted. It wasn't the game, it was the feeling that something was out of place. I was supposed to be capturing the thrill of the crowd, but my attention kept shifting to the people around me, their faces too tense, too nervous. I even caught a few glances exchanged between people I didn't recognize, their eyes wide, as though they were silently warning each other of something. Halfway through the third quarter, the stadium lights flickered. It was brief, but enough to make everyone stop for a moment and look around. At first, people laughed it off, assuming it was just a technical glitch. But then, the lights flickered again, longer this time. The noise in the stadium faltered for a brief second, but then the crowd picked up, as though they were trying to ignore the strange occurrence. As a journalist, I had seen technical failures before, but this felt different. It was too deliberate, too calculated. By the time the fourth quarter arrived, the tension had only grown. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a subtle vibration that was easily ignored amidst the roar of the crowd. But then, a second buzz. I glanced down at the screen, seeing an urgent notification. It was a message from my editor, but before I could open it, I heard a sharp, ear-splitting sound. It wasn't the crack of a football hitting a helmet or the sound of the crowd. No, it was a sound that cut through everything, sending chills down my spine. The stadium seemed to hold its breath as the noise echoed through the air. I didn't understand what had happened at first, but then chaos erupted. People started screaming, running, pushing past each other, as if they were trying to escape from something. The security officers, who had been watching everything with stern faces just moments ago, now seemed confused, disoriented, unsure of what was going on. The stadium lights flickered again, and I saw flashes in the crowd, bright, rapid bursts of light that looked like gunfire. But I couldn't be sure. The air became thick with panic, and I found myself caught in the rush of bodies. I turned toward the nearest exit, instinctively moving with the crowd. It was then that I saw the source of the chaos, a man standing near one of the entrances, his eyes wild, his movements erratic. He wasn't a fan. He wasn't a member of the press. He looked like someone who didn't belong here, his clothes mismatched and his posture tense. He had something in his hand, something that glinted under the lights. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. But then, I saw it clearly, a gun. Time seemed to slow as I realized what was happening. He wasn't just a bystander. He wasn't caught up in the chaos. He was a part of it, a deliberate part of it. He was the one who had brought the violence to the stadium. As I started to retreat, trying to get to safety, I caught a glimpse of my editor's message. The words seemed to jump off the screen, a chilling premonition of what was about to unfold. We've received intel of a potential terrorist attack at the Super Bowl. Evacuate now. Stay safe. The message had come too late. The gunman's actions had already set the wheels in motion. People were scrambling to find safety, but there was nowhere to go. The exits were clogged with frightened fans, and the aisles were becoming a sea of panic. Security forces had begun to take action, but it wasn't enough. The gunman was moving, his path calculated, his aim precise. I found myself frozen in place for a moment, caught between the flashing lights and the screeching sirens. My mind raced with the need to do something, anything to make sense of it all. But in the midst of the chaos, there was nothing I could do. The gunman was too close, and the sound of his footsteps echoed in the growing silence. People around me were ducking, covering, trying to make themselves as small as possible. It was then that I heard the unmistakable sound of a gunshot, followed by another. I ducked instinctively, but I couldn't help but turn back, trying to understand what was happening. The gunman was standing just a few feet from me now. He was aiming toward the press section, his face hidden behind a mask, but I could see the look of determination in his eyes. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I hide? Would it even make a difference? Before I could act, a wave of security personnel rushed past me, heading straight for the gunman. The stadium, still shrouded in confusion, seemed to come to life in a chaotic, brutal flash. The gunman didn't flinch, didn't seem to hesitate. He fired again, hitting his target in the confusion. In that moment, I felt my heart stop. The world around me seemed to collapse as I realized the horrifying truth. A journalist, a fellow reporter, had just been shot. A colleague, someone I knew from my work in the industry, had fallen victim to the senseless violence unfolding before us. The chaos intensified, but everything seemed to blur into one long, distorted memory. The rest of the evening is a fog of images, flashes of red, the shouts of officers, the scream of sirens, and the darkness that settled over the stadium as the lights finally cut out completely. The coverage I was supposed to provide had turned into a nightmare, a tragedy that would leave an indelible mark on the city, on the sport, and on all of us who had been caught in the middle of it. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between the chaos and the crushing weight of what had just unfolded. The world around me was spinning, a blur of sound and light that seemed both too loud and too quiet at the same time. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The gunshots, the shouts, the realization that I had witnessed something far darker than I had ever imagined. The stadium lights, once so bright and full of life, had now gone out entirely, leaving the arena shrouded in darkness. The only light was a flash of the emergency beacons, casting erratic, strobe-like shadows across the space. I could feel the air grow thicker, the weight of fear settling over the crowd like a suffocating blanket. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hallways, but I couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate as the gravity of the situation sunk in. The first instinct was to run, to escape this madness, to find safety, but my legs felt frozen, as if the ground beneath me had suddenly turned to quicksand. The tragic irony of it all was that I, a journalist trained to cover the most dangerous of situations, felt utterly powerless in the face of this crisis. I had always believed that a reporter could stand at the front lines, bear witness, and bring the truth to light. But now, I felt nothing but the weight of the tragedy, the helplessness that comes when the worst possible scenario unfolds before you. As the minutes dragged on, I finally managed to break from my paralysis, moving as quickly as I could through the corridors. I knew I had to get out of the stadium, away from the danger, but the hallways were filled with people rushing in every direction, their faces etched with fear. Some were injured, others just trying to get away, but there was no clear path. The only thing that stood out amidst the confusion was the haunting thought: how many others had fallen victim to this violence? How many lives had been shattered in the blink of an eye? I didn't have time to process it fully. I had been trained to work under pressure, but this was something entirely different. The gunman was still out there somewhere, and I didn't know what to do next. Should I continue trying to escape? Should I stay and help? Or should I focus on reporting the story I had been sent here to cover? But as I looked around, I realized something far more important. This wasn't about me anymore. This wasn't about getting the perfect angle or capturing the breaking news story. This was about survival. This was about making it out alive. I pressed on, my breath coming in shallow bursts, until I finally reached one of the emergency exits. Outside, the cold air hit me like a shock, the quiet of the streets stark in contrast to the chaos inside the stadium. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as police and emergency vehicles swarmed the area. The world beyond the stadium seemed oddly serene, as if the horrors of the Super Bowl shooting hadn't yet reached this corner of the city. But I knew that wouldn't last. I stumbled into a nearby alleyway, trying to gather my thoughts, but my mind kept replaying the events in quick flashes. The gunman, the gunshots, the panicked crowd. And then, the horrible realization that I had lost something much more than just a colleague. I had lost the sense of safety, the belief that these events, the ones I covered, would always be safely separated from me. As I tried to get my bearings, my phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. It was an update from my network. Tragic incident at the Super Bowl. Reporter confirmed dead. Multiple casualties reported. Police on scene. Investigation ongoing. The weight of the words hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was real. Someone I had worked with, someone I had seen just hours before in the press room, was now gone. The realization was numbing, but it also made the entire situation feel personal. It was no longer just a story I was covering. It had become part of my reality. My colleague's death, their loss. It was something I could never undo, something I could never escape. The city was still in shock. The Super Bowl had been meant to be a celebration, a global spectacle, a moment of joy for millions of fans. But for the victims, for those of us caught in the middle of it, it had become a night of terror. And now, as the hours passed, the aftermath was just beginning to unfold. The news was filled with updates, the investigation continuing into the identity of the gunman, the possible motives behind the attack. But none of it seemed to matter. The damage had already been done. The tragedy would forever be etched into the history of the Super Bowl, a dark chapter that no one would ever forget. I returned to my hotel that night, too shaken to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened. How had this attack come to pass? What had driven someone to bring violence to a place meant for joy? And most of all, what was next? The days that followed were filled with interviews, statements, and constant news coverage. The city, the sports world, and the entire country were grappling with the fallout of the tragedy. The Super Bowl, once a symbol of celebration and unity, was now a symbol of pain and loss. For me, the weeks that followed would be marked by the heavy burden of a story that would never leave me. It would be a reminder that the line between the observer and the affected was always thinner than we wanted to believe. I knew that I would have to cover the aftermath, the investigation, the funeral, the healing process, but I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever be able to shake the image of that gunman, standing in chaos, his face a mask of intent, as he carried out his act of violence. I still don't know what his motives were. Some say it was political, others say it was personal. But in the end, it didn't matter. The victims were dead, their families devastated, and a city forever altered. And as for me, I will never forget that moment. The moment when the Super Bowl, the great American tradition, became something else entirely. The violence had shattered the illusion that we were safe, that we could be separated from the tragedies we report. It had come for all of us, and in that moment, there was no escaping it.